trends in misinformation. They're going to break down what they've encountered so far in the election cycle, and they're going to explain how to best cover the electoral process with factual information. Misinformation is obviously tricky, and there's a lot of ways it can trip up well-meaning reporters and editors. So we're going to spend about 20 minutes today on a primer about misinformation from the AP's perspective, and then proceed onto Q&A. Andrew, my esteemed fellow community manager, will be manning the chat and sending out some helpful links. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. We'll collect those, note them, and then ask them during the Q&A process for you. The presentation is going to be recorded today, so feel free to turn off your video and or change your name if you prefer to do so. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Amanda and Karen. Thanks so much, folks.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amanda Barrett, and I am going to share my screen with you here. All right, so I am overseeing our news coordination efforts, and that includes misinformation and fact checking. And I am joined today by my esteemed colleague, Karen Mahabir, who is really AP's misinformation guru. She is the person that gets called in all the time to guide reporters who are talking about misinformation or facing challenges with figuring out how to report on it, as a consultant for editing desks and anyone else that has to deal with misinformation. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. Today we'll be detailing AP's efforts to fact check public figures and debunk misinformation. We'll talk a little bit about our process for evaluating claims and give you an overview of the landscape of misinformation. And as importantly, what sort of misinformation we're seeing today and what we could see closer to Election Day and beyond. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about how your newsrooms can do this work and really help your audiences separate fact from fiction. So AP's fact-checking operation, computer is tripping. Sorry, my computer is doing its own thing right now. I really wanted to talk a little bit about, give you an overview of fact-checking and misinformation at AP, which really has expanded tremendously in recent years and encompasses three main efforts. The biggest one is our AP fact check. That's a special vehicle that we use for determining the veracity of a statement from a public figure. It's an item that we've really been producing for decades, and one that is extremely popular with both our customers and our audiences. And while, you know, this is a really dedicated effort, I would say that fact checking really fuels everything we do at the AP. It's something that's in our DNA. Every video is fact checked, as are our photos, our graphics, our text stories. All of that work happens before we put out anything. That said, the fact check has become main for us, a main vehicle, because we realized that we were fact checking statements and stories, but we really needed a way to dissect and really examine certain statements on their own and pull this out as a separate component of our coverage. So today we have a team that produces AP fact checks, but any journalist across the company can produce one. And our fact check reporters are often called upon to work with other departments and other journalists on other continents to help pull them together. Oh, my computer is doing, oh, forgive me, it is tripping. I'm having a day. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing for just a second because my computer is really unhappy. So the second area that we really focus in on is the online debunking of misinformation. For years, we've had a separate team that focuses on false and misleading claims that are going viral or have the potential to. across platforms like Facebook and Twitter, YouTube, and others. Since the 2016 election, we've been examining and debunking major false claims and have also been tracking how they've evolved, how they are repeated over time, and can cross-pollinate on platforms. We debunk a multitude of claims and false material every week, including memes, text stories, tweets, photos, and videos. And we're also doing this work in Spanish. We have a team based in Mexico City that is examining claims made in Spanish or aimed at Latino communities in the United States. We produce the best of this work in a weekly roundup called Not Real News, in English and in Spanish every Friday, and it's also very popular with audiences. And lastly, we have dedicated misinformation reporters who are identifying and covering trends and strategies in misinformation, coordinated disinformation networks, as well as large-scale conspiracy theories and hoaxes. They take an overview approach to the rise and proliferation of misinformation, while also delving into the details of bad actors and bogus accounts, the possibility of bots, and the activity in private Facebook groups. They produced some great work around the coronavirus and election misinformation, as well as the Black Lives Matter protests this year. I'm going to hand it over to Karen.
Hi, thank you, Amanda. So today, with just 3 weeks to go before election week, I thought it would be good to go over how we produce this work and to offer some tips on how your newsrooms might be able to get started on doing more accountability and explanatory journalism. And I really think that, as we face a misinformation crisis and declining trust in our industry and the upcoming election, I really can't think of a more important time to be doing this work. I would say that certainly for us at the AP, our fact-checking operation is now working harder than it ever has before. So a lot of folks ask us how we go about finding material to fact check. And there are a number of factors here. So first, we review public statements from key influencers. And we really focus on those whose words carry weight with people. So we listen to speeches and debates in real time. We review pages and pages of transcripts, and we monitor tweets. And with the candidates, we examine campaign literature and political ads as well. And again, we're really taking note of the claims that we think are going to have the most resonance with people, or that might be related to our news cycle. But we're also looking at the claims we think that people are going to have questions about. We also monitor misinformation online for those claims by following accounts and relying on monitoring dashboards like TweetDeck. So on those, we're using curated lists around certain terms and phrases that can lead us to claims. And sometimes they're really just simple phrases and words, like fake news, or is this real, or even just rumor, or misleading, or not true. We also use social monitoring tools like CrowdTangle and NewsWhip to give us a little bit of insight into what is bubbling up on social media. And we have a roster of mis and disinformation experts who we talk to almost daily, as well as several groups who are monitoring the space of misinformation and disinformation for daily and weekly trends. So once we've gone through that and we've decided that we do want to tackle a claim and really look at it, I like to run through a simple checklist. And I wanted to go through some of the questions that I ask of myself and our reporters. So simply, who made the claim? What exactly did they say and in what context? Is it newsworthy? And then how much attention is it really getting? And for me, that last question is an especially important one for us in deciding whether to move forward with checking a claim. And it's one that we're constantly asking ourselves, really from the moment we start our day to the moment we end our day, and even after. It's, is this claim worth giving oxygen to, and what might the risks be in publishing material about this misinformation? And I think it's really important to note that, we are approaching all claims in the same way. So we're looking critically across the board. We are prioritizing the claims we want to check. We investigate them. We let the facts fall where they will. and then we remain committed to reporting what we find out. And often those claims are going to come from those in power because, again, they have the most weight. And sometimes I think it may seem, that we're really focused on fact-checking President Trump and his administration, but really we're fact-checking the person who sits in the Oval Office, and regardless of who that person is. And I think, in fact, until Trump, we had produced more fact checks on Obama than anyone else. So I want to go through a little bit about how we put together the fact check. I like to ask the reporter to tell me basically, again, what the claim is verbatim, and then what the first two sentences of the rebuttal would say. So basically, are we going to say that it's true or false or somewhere in the middle? And then what's our evidence for that? And this is a practice that I developed sort of organically over time as we started having more and more people across the company contribute to fact checks. And I just think it's a really easy and simple way to get the fact check framed and to determine if our claim is actually fact checkable. In other words, is it free of opinion, and can we get to the bottom of it? And it's what I like to call a clean claim. And then once we can establish that we can move forward, I ask another series of questions. Among them, what is going to be needed to pull this over the finish line? So what material do we need? Who do we need to talk to? What are all the ways that this could be criticized? And can we defend why we chose to tackle this claim? What sort of questions might we have for the person who made this claim? Have they said anything similar in the past? And what other ways might this person have conveyed this claim? For example, did the person say it publicly and then also tweet about it? And even then, after we have completed that work and we have put the fact check together, several people will still need to vet it to be sure that we're being fair and thorough and, most importantly, 100% accurate. Now, when it comes to online misinformation, obviously, the last thing that we want to do is further amplify it. So again, we ask ourselves a lot of questions throughout that process. And I want to note that sometimes the status of a claim from the time it's first detected to the time the debunk is ready to be published could change. So throughout, I like to focus on asking, do we believe that this is in the public's interest still? Is the information harmful? For example, with coronavirus claims or with election claims, could it undermine voting? Are there clear signs that people are being deceived by the misinformation? Also, is the claim getting an increasing amount of attention and or spreading from one social media platform to another? Also, has it changed in format? In other words, has it gone from, say, a tweet to a meme, and is there now a video about it on YouTube? And how much risk is there that we're going to significantly amplify this misinformation? Have we reached a point where this has saturated the public to a degree that we don't need to worry about that? I think a really good example of that is the pandemic video, which contained several falsehoods and was so widely shared when we published this story that there was a little risk of really further amplifying it. And then also a really good question I like to ask is, are bad actors trying to bait us? Can we debunk this material in a way that doesn't help them accomplish their disinformation aims? And what I mean by that is, are there bad actors who may sometimes put out information knowing that we're going to want to debunk that claim? And in doing so, we're just essentially keeping it alive. And, so what do we do in a situation like that? And I think in cases like that, it's really good to see, does this individual claim fall into a family of similar claims? And then to think about maybe addressing it in, say, a larger story where we can provide context and be more responsible in the reporting around it, and maybe look at sort of how it's spreading and what the motivations are around pushing this material. I think sometimes the solution in cases like that is to find a way to debunk the claim deeper into the story so that we make the point about what's wrong, but we're not putting it right at the top, in the headline or the lead. But again, I mean, this is always a judgment call. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing today. And I will just say that it has been quite a challenging year for fact checkers. The coronavirus, the protests, a fluctuating economy, the upcoming election, all of this has led to a lot of uncertainty and questioning. And in this period, it has created a space for misinformation to step in with supposed answers. So we have seen and dealt with a lot of misinformation around the coronavirus, from claims of bogus cures to theories about how the virus is spreading and where it came from, and even whether the whole pandemic is a hoax. And not all of these claims fall into the bucket of disinformation. And that is, information that is disseminated with the intention of misleading or deceiving. Some of it seemed to have been shared unwittingly by folks who may not have known what was true or not, but thought, oh, I just better share this in case it might be true. And in fact, a really good example of that are the text messages that we saw about an impending national lockdown, which several friends and family members sent my way. And certainly, I think our job as fact checkers, was difficult during this period during coronavirus, especially in the month of March, when we were all searching for answers and trying very hard to carefully separate fact and real science from false information. Later, we saw a lot of false claims around the protests outside state capitals, as well as around the protests around Black Lives Matter. And we continue to see claims focus on the election and on the voting process, and which we know is being conducted in a very different way this year. And we've also seen claims around the candidates and their fitness for office, they're really their health and mental capacity. So going forward, I think, it's kind of hard to say what we're going to see and, how misinformation might change, but I wanted to go over the areas around the election specifically, where we're already starting to see activity. And I will say that in recent weeks, we have debunked many claims around incorrect ballot counting, as well as missing, lost, and discarded ballots. And we could see that increase as we get closer to election day and election week. And, I think as with every election, there may be legitimate problems at the polling stations with relation to lines and accessibility, operational issues, or the polling machines themselves. Just this week, in fact, we reported on a severed fiber optic cable that shut down Virginia's online registration system. So our job is really going to be to separate what is legitimate from what is not. And we may also see claims around fraud, and of course we'll be investigating that and really leveraging the 50-state presence that we have on the ground. And again, I think we'll see more claims around the health of the candidates, physically and mentally. So our team is going to be working with other teams at the Associated Press, including the technology team, the politics team, the UGC team, to really get to the bottom of those claims. And we're also going to be paying close attention to what the candidates themselves are saying about the races and the voting process. And I think it's really important to note that while we're looking at misinformation in the run-up to Election Day and on the day itself, we really want to focus too on the days after, when we could find ourselves waiting for results. And I think this could be a prime time for people, again, in the absence of answers, to try to fill that space with supposed answers. And of course, during all of this, we are going to be looking for any signs of foreign or domestic disinformation campaigns. There are a number of people looking for signs of interference, and we're in touch with them, as well as with the social media platforms, which are now taking more action, actually, against misinformation. So we wanted to make this useful, so I wanted to really share some guidance that might be good for newsrooms who are looking to increase their fact-checking work or debunking or misinformation coverage. And the first thing that I would say is that if you don't have the time or the resources to break out fact-check material in a separate item, just include it in your main story, so that if someone makes a dubious claim, you're able to essentially fact-check that claim before you get to the end of the sentence or the end of the paragraph. The other thing I would say is that I would really advise doing more explanatory journalism now. I think that the more that we can explain the voting process this year, the better. In fact, that is what led us to start a new series called Vision 2020, which tackles the big questions people have around this year's election. So for example, questions like, what if there is a contested election? Or how has the US election infrastructure been enhanced since 2016? So we're really looking to get accurate information out to people in a variety of reader and mobile friendly products. And I also think it's, an effort that could help preempt some of the misinformation that could come our way. So I'm going to turn it over.
How do you get prepared?
Yes.
If you're setting out to do fact checks, we would advise that you read the work of others, including us, of course, to see how we're doing them. And that means looking at what material we are including, how we're reporting out the facts and delivering them. At the AP, we really strive for sober, dispassionate language in our fact checks. These items should be very straight and to the point. If you are debunking online material and it's a story, think critically about it. Think about how the material is being presented and what the presenter might be trying to get you to believe and why. Look at the headline. Has it been written in a way to elicit an emotional response from the reader? Is there a byline? What sources are being cited? Who's being quoted? Can you Google them? Do these people even exist? What material is being included? And more importantly, what is being left out? Is there important context? Look at other sources and see if this event or speech was covered by others. And if it's a photo, you can always do a quick reverse image search on Google to see if you can determine where the image may have originated or if it's been manipulated. Lastly, you really want to know your facts. Both Karen and I are big proponents of prep. Prep is king. So you want to prep ahead of time if you are thinking that you're going to have different topics or issues come up, especially if it's like a speech or a debate, and you want to know what's relevant to your newsroom and your audiences. If your audiences are telling you that they're very interested in a specific issue that they're voting on, you want to do your own reporting and do the research and have all the facts you need at your fingertips. And you can make it easier on yourself. Sometimes being very organized and prepared can really make a world of difference when at the big moment you're racing to get something out. Thank you so much for joining us today. And now we're ready to take your questions.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate that presentation. That was a really great primer on so many of the topics that are relevant to misinformation. Immediately, what comes to mind, and again, just as a reminder, folks, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We'll note them and we'll get to them. But to start off, to kind of close the loop on your misinformation work or your fact-checking work, are there any ways you evaluate your work? For example, do you ever do postmortems about fact checks or stories that you were unsure about? Whether you were like amplifying a claim to see what impact you had? What does that conversation look like?
Sure, I can take that. We do, and our audience keeps us accountable too. So we will often look back at the fact checks that we've done because, again, sometimes we see claims that are repeated. And when I say that, I think, we see candidates repeat claims and we look at, what are we saying about that claim now that it's come back up? But also on online misinformation, we see that. So we will see a claim pop up that we addressed a year and a half ago. So we're constantly referring back to what we've done and examining, how did we write that? What language did we use? Why did this come back up? What is it being connected to now? Is it something new? Is it something different? So we are doing a lot of that work. And also we get a lot of emails. A lot of people write to us with suggestions and tips and some criticism. And we carefully read through all of those emails. And because I think that when you're trying to get a fact check out, and to really present the facts in a sober and clean way, there's a lot that goes into that. And we spent a lot of time really evaluating just what does our headline say? You know, are we, you know, in some way indirectly promoting this misinformation? So, so yes, the short answer is yes, we spend a lot of time reviewing our past work.
Great, thank you so much. I have a question from Elizabeth. She says, I'm a journalist turned election observer from the UK. So this is a really important question because it provides additional context to how elections have run over a variety of cycles or a variety of years. Is this election different from previous elections in this regard? And if so, in what way? Like, can you give us some historical context about how misinformation has looked like in the past few years?
Sure. This election is different than previous elections in so many ways. First of all, the obvious that we have a lot more people who are voting by absentee and vote by mail, which has created a lot of questioning and confusion. And, you know, we've certainly seen a multitude of claims around just that, the voting process. I think also what's made this different is that I feel like we're more prepared coming into this election, having learned from the 2016 election. I think that, you know, what we learned after the 2016 election, mostly in 2017, about what we had gone through, provided a pretty solid blueprint of what to look for when it comes to disinformation campaigns and the way that misinformation is disseminated. I think also one huge difference is that we have so many more fact checkers in the space, and we have so many more experts who are devoted to misinformation and disinformation, who are actively looking for signs of misinformation, and really much more developed tools at getting behind, you know, who might be pushing some of these accounts. So, so I think, you know, in some ways we're seeing a lot of misinformation, and, you know, I think that there was a lot in 2016 as well. But I'd say the huge difference is preparing for this new challenge in the way that people are voting this year in America, but also knowing that a lot of people are with us in the fight against misinformation.
Great, thank you. And on that front, or on the front of how things have evolved, do you think about, this is a question from Tom, our executive director, do you think about what some people call strategic amplification, looking for a tipping point about when to ignore false claims at the risk of amplifying versus when they have become big enough that they cannot be ignored? What might that look like, and are there any signals of when someone's actually strategically trying to amplify some misinformation?
This is something that we deal with honestly every single minute of our day. And I think that, you know, people do refer to that tipping point. You know, people say, you know, this idea that the claim is so out there and it's maybe on so many platforms and it's in so many formats that it just can't be ignored. And you know, the first thing that comes to mind with this question is the pandemic video. When we saw that, you know, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to fact check, first of all, because it was filled with falsehoods, and we saw it really accelerating in popularity. And we wrestled with this. You know, how do we responsibly report this out? What, you know, what is the right way and when is the right way to do this? And I think sometimes, I mean, really, I think it comes down to a judgment call. And I think, you know, there are some times when you feel like, okay, this is just so out there that we actually just need to combat it. And in terms of the strategy around that amplification, I mean, certainly that's something that we're looking for. So, you know, and we're working with groups who can identify that. So like if there's a tweet out there that is suddenly being retweeted like crazy, one of the first red flags for me is, you know, is this authentic behavior or not? And that's the kind of thing that would cause us to immediately get on the reporting, talk to all the experts that we have and all the friends that we have to be able to kind of figure out, you know, is this happening for real? Or, you know, is there something coordinated behind it that maybe isn't authentic?
I would add to that and say, don't forget that you don't have to do it as a fact check. You can do it as a story. And if you choose to write about something like that video as a story, that allows you to bring in the voices of experts, that allows you to bring in the context that you need to really give your audience a real picture of where this sits in the news ecosystem and what's going on around it. So that's always a good tool that you can rely on so that you can capture everything all together and give that as a completed package to your reader.
That's a great point. Yeah, fact checks don't necessarily have to look like fact checks. And on that question of framing, I think I'll follow up with some questions on framing. Tom also asked, do you have recommendations for how to frame or present a knockdown so that you don't risk confusing people that you're repeating the falsehood? And I'll throw in Mark's question as well. What about terminology, misinformation, disinformation, false claim, lie? Do you use those when you're framing your fact checks or your stories that are debunking?
Yeah, so let me take the first one. And I think, this question gets asked a lot. And, a lot of people in this field refer to what's known as a truth sandwich, which is when you are, basically saying what is the accurate information, and then you're saying what's false, and then you're debunking it. So that you're not leading with the false information. And I think it's a pretty responsible way, I would say, to frame it. We think about this a lot in our headlines, and we're very careful to basically debunk the false information in the headline. And when it comes to terminology, absolutely. Yes, we do use the words misinformation and disinformation and falsehoods. And I think that I think people have a pretty good understanding now of the terms. And in those stories, we go through a lot of work to kind of carefully explain exactly, specifically, what is wrong and how we know it's wrong, like how we arrived at this conclusion. What is the evidence that we have that supports that? And I think that's really, really key to fact checking. I think sometimes it can be very easy to say, well, I can't find any evidence that this occurred, so it probably didn't occur. And it can make it very difficult, in some cases for fact checking. I think, for us at the AAP, we go a step further and we say, it wasn't this, it was that. And I think you have to really try to provide that to readers so that they know they're walking away from the fact check with correct and accurate information.
Great, thank you. And that makes me, so this one's a little bit more complicated, but it's also on the question of language and framing. So when you have a situation like, so what does the AP do to ensure that language accurately describes a situation when a claim is in dispute, not because of the facts on the ground, but the perception of those facts? So let's talk about Georgia, for example. There's long lines during early voting in Georgia. Some people see long lines and think of it as a clear-cut example of voter suppression, while others note that with 3 weeks of voting remaining, it's just high engagement with this election. Is this a dispute that you would fact check, or how would you address that sort of discrepancy that comes with maybe a political perception or some other perception that kind of, gets involved or spills over into the facts?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I can take a first stab, and then Amanda, if you want to fill in my gaps. I don't think that we have to necessarily look at issues like that through the prism of just misinformation or disinformation. I think in cases like that, we want to do both. We want to say, here's what's going on. Here's an accurate story about what is happening. Like the Virginia case. This really happened, and we have a long reported story that explains it completely. Separately, if we see misinformation attached to that, we can address it in a different vehicle. I think there is absolutely no problem in having, and maybe we do it a third way. Maybe we actually do a debunk, we have a straight story, and then we have an explainer about these sort of issues. So I think, it's important not to kind of box yourself into one way of looking at something. I think we have to think about all the different ways that readers could come to that information and, that we could touch them.
We so think alike. That was exactly what I was going to say.
That's great. And that's a good lead into the next question I have about, so we talked to, in a previous event, we talked to Jane Litvinenko, the BuzzFeed reporter that focuses on disinformation. And so one thing she mentioned was that she centers human stories and experiences in her fact checking because that's much more effective and crucial in her work. If you see someone else being experiencing that misinformation, I think it's that much more convincing. Are there any other tools or methods in the AP's arsenal to make a fact check land better with readers? Anything you can do to turn the heat down on topics that have become overly politicized?
Again, I'll take this first. I think Jane's exactly right. And I really respect her reporting. And I think it's a good thing to do, as much as we can connect with the person, connect with the reader. I think that's great. I think also in a fact check or a debunk, it's really important, as much as we can, to provide a lot of primary sources to point to where this information came from, or to annotate your fact check. And I think that makes it real. A lot of times when I think about how we're assembling our fact checks, I like to think, well, if I gave this to my sister with all of these links, could she possibly come to the same conclusion? Could she really put this fact check together herself? And I feel like, we're really doing our job when we can do that. And I think that it really instills a lot of trust with the reader or the viewer, if we're doing it in a video or something, to be able to provide that. So I like to do that. And also I really like, when we can provide history around the claim, especially if it's something that we're addressing again, that we addressed in 2018, like during the midterms. A great example is when we did a fact check and a debunk, and I think a story as well, when Kamala Harris's eligibility to run for office was in question. Certainly, we saw so many claims when she announced to run for presidency, and they all came rushing back during when she was picked for the vice president slot. And I think providing the history of what we have seen already, showing that, like, look, this is where it comes from, and we've done the work here. I think that's also really, really important.
I would agree with that. I think, being able to show that context and showing change over time. Karen's team did a really good story about the coronavirus claims and how some of the same groups that were involved in, say, protesting around the shutdowns around the coronavirus, once the Black Lives Matter protests started to heat up, turned their attention and sometimes even changed their name to address the Black Lives Matter protests. And so that was really helpful to understand, how the change was happening, to follow the way these groups were acting, to explain some of the misinformation that we were seeing.
Great, thank you. I think we have a follow-up from Tom. There's research that people tend to resent or dismiss fact checks of the people they like, and enjoy or respect fact checks of people they dislike, assuming they don't find the fact check to be entirely true. Do you have strategies to make resistant audiences more receptive to fact checks? And maybe a follow-up to that is, like, do those strategies depend on the channel in which those fact checks are being delivered? Do you do something differently on social media than you would when you're doing it on platform?
Wow, that's a great question. I'm not surprised you asked it. So, I think the reality is that we live in pretty polarizing times right now, and I wouldn't say that we have strategies per se to reach people, but our overall strategy is that in our fact checks, we do try to strike a very conversational tone, and I think that can make a big difference. It's kind of like when, your mom comes to you with misinformation and says this is true. You don't want to really smack that hand away. You want to kind of hold the hand and say, well, let me just show you some things. And I think that's kind of what I think about as we're assembling debunks and stories and fact checks. I think also one thing that is that we're doing more of now, which I really like, is turning the fact check material into ways that are more mobile friendly. So for example, we're doing fact check cards on Instagram and Twitter. And, so I think kind of reaching people in ways that aren't just, I'm going to scold you and tell you, like, why you're wrong for thinking this or whatever. I think that there are ways to kind of bridge that gap.
And I would add too, that adding more explanatory pieces, more explanatory journalism, so that it's not that people feel attacked. You're just laying out the straight facts for them. It's really been helpful. We've had a great reception to the Vision 2020 pieces that really followed up actually on something that Karen created for the coronavirus viral questions. And people have really been involved with those, and they get a lot of readership, particularly because you're asking the question and then just laying out the answer. And so I think that makes things a little more accessible for folks who may be on different sides of a partisan line.
And just on that, I would say with viral questions, we really try to ask the question that we think anybody would ask. So I'm thinking like, what would I Google if I had a question about this? And so I try to make the question as approachable as possible, as well as the explanation.
Absolutely. And on that note of making things approachable, let's talk about some of the practical aspects of this work, especially for local journalists. So you mentioned annotating your fact checks. Who are some of the experts and groups you connect with about misinformation and disinformation? If I was a local reporter and I didn't know where to get started, who might I look for information on this?
Well, there's a lot of places. Certainly American Press Institute is one. Pointer would be another. First Draft, Bellingcat. It's all of these. I mean, there's so many organizations out there that have really helped us and inspired us in this work. And I think if you're going to groups looking for specifically around, say, tweets or the use of hashtags and disseminating misinformation and things like that, Findsight, Graphica is good. We talk regularly to the Wilson Center, nonpartisan group in Washington, D.C. And to various disinformation experts. I mean, one of the great things that I have seen, even in the last 2 years, is that there are more and more experts, yes, but also professors who are focusing on this work and doing a lot of really great research. So, we sort of just pull from everywhere we can, depending on what we need. But those are among the groups that I would point people to.
Great, thank you. Those are great resources. I think one of the biggest hurdles that local journalists are probably going to encounter out there is the post-election misinformation contesting the results. How are you guys planning to address that? What other possible mis or disinformation issues are you planning for after the election during that kind of potentially crazy time that's we're facing?
I think that's a really good question. We've talked a lot about that inside AP. And really what we're focused on is doing the reporting. And if someone were to make a claim, we need to report it out. We need to find out what is true and what is not. And we're relying on our own information. We have what we call votecasts, which we're using where we're talking to a lot of voters about their feelings. And we're also have a lot of people out in the field covering races. We're going to be really formulating our own opinion, but we're going to take our time. We're not really going to rely on other news organizations. And if they were to declare a victor, we still need to do our own work to make sure that we are in a good situation and we know exactly what we're doing. So while I worry about that, that's not like the biggest worry, I have to admit. We're still worried about things like, we have people working in the office, we have people not working in the office. We could have technical issues. There are things like that that are also at play for us. So I think, just doing the work like we always do, reporting out the situation, doing our research is going to be key to being well positioned when any kind of call like that comes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, doing your work, doing your research, that's super important. And on that front, can you go into a little bit more detail about how you work with other journalists at the AP to help contextualize misleading information or debunk false claims in other stories? What do those conversations look like? And is that a two-way conversation or a one-way conversation? Do you help them find their stories and find things to debunk our work on?
Yeah, this might be my favorite question so far. Absolutely, all of that. It's a two-way street, and sometimes it's a four-way street, and sometimes it's a 6-lane highway. Like we are, what we see and surface, we will often reach out to people in other bureaus, other continents, and say, hey, I mean, it's a really casual thing. Hey, have you seen this? Because we're seeing a lot of this. And sometimes that person will say, actually, yeah, I'm actually seeing that on my feed a lot, and like, I'm getting a lot of questions around this. Okay, let's work together. And so, they'll tell us what they know, the actual facts from the ground, and we'll pair that with the misinformation that we're seeing, and then we'll put something together. We'll put a fact check together. We also rely on, I mean, I think one of the wonderful things about the AP is that there's a lot of in-house experts. And so if something comes up that, because misinformation, you're kind of a generalist. So if you see something and you're just like, hey, they're talking about this tax plan, I don't, is this real? I don't know. We have experts that we can go to. And so often we'll pair up a fact check reporter with the expert to pull something together. I think one of the times where, and where this sort of success was like most evident to me were during the protests, the Yellow Vest protests in Paris. And we saw all sorts of claims. And of course, we're not there on the ground. We don't know what these streets look like, and we don't know, what the crowds look like, but our reporters on the ground did. And so there was a lot of visual verification that we were able to do around that. And that happens all the time. I don't think a day goes by where I don't get an email from somebody outside of the United States saying, hey, just want to bring your attention to this weird thing I'm seeing. And, and then we started a conversation about, let's monitor this, let's really try to understand what's happening. So, so yes, it happens all the time. And it's sort of a wonderful thing.
That's great, because it makes me wonder if you're crowdsourcing this special problem that we're facing, what have you learned about handling the special problem of President Trump and his kind of the fire hose of falsehoods that he's spreading through Twitter, which are often intended to get mainstream media to amplify them? Do you ignore some of them? Do you check every one of them? How is that situation involved, especially for context, like how would a local reporter approach that?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, we approach it in two ways. Actually, we approach it in multiple ways, but two main ways. One is that, yes, we are fact checking President Trump. If he is saying something that we think is really important and needs to be checked, a lot of the claims around coronavirus, for example, we're absolutely doing fact checks on that. What is interesting is that we will sometimes see online misinformation that is related to those same claims. So we're looking at it from the top and we're looking at it from the bottom. And sometimes we're seeing how those two things connect, which is, one of the things that gets me very, very excited about this job. And so we're looking at it from both ends, really. And I mean, I think that we are not, we have a really robust team, but that doesn't mean that we can tackle all of the claims. And I don't, nor do I think that we would want to. We want to really focus on the ones that are the big ones, the ones, the big fish, the ones that are going to, again, really resonate with people and that, people are going to have questions about.
And absolutely. I do think, a fair amount of the claims that he is making are handled in different ways. So some of them are going to be in stories that the Washington team is doing. If their health claims are going to be stories that the health and science team is doing. And if they're business or economy related, they may be something that the business team is doing. So we may still be fact checking related to his claims, but they're going to be embedded in that story. And hopefully in the sentence where he's made his statement or the next paragraph, where we're fact checking it right then and there.
Oh, I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
My apologies. Speaking of that landscape, do you, being where you are, do you try to avoid things that other fact checkers have already checked, or is that something that you'll still cover depending on the situation?
Oh, no. We don't try to avoid any of that. And I think healthy competition is good. And I think it's actually a good thing. I think it's a good thing when, different fact-checking organizations or reporters go after the same claims. Different, outlets are going to reach different people. So no, I don't try to avoid anything. I mean, we make our own editorial decisions, based on judgment and based on what we think is really important. And if someone else is doing it, okay. We're not going to, we may look at it, we're not going to rely on it. We're going to do our own work. But no, I think there's a healthy competitive spirit among fact checkers.
I like that. So on that front of kind of the editorial process, one of the things that you mentioned that stood out to me is that you look into claims that threaten the integrity of your daily news report, which I'm sure is a pain point for a lot of local news orgs, whether it be things coming in through social media comments or people constantly challenging what's putting out there as factual reporting. How does that process work? And where are you looking for those claims that challenge what you're putting out there into the world?
I mean, we're looking across the spectrum, and we're really kind of seeing which ones surface. I mean, I think with fact checking, you don't want to look too deeply, right? You want to look at the ones that are actually hitting people. So, and you know, I think in situations like that, the way that we handle it is that we can have the accurate story, the main bar that's going out, but in parallel, we may need to debunk some aspect of it that is being questioned online. One of the things that I'm thinking about now is during the Las Vegas shooting a few years ago, we had tremendous coverage. I mean, you know, the day of, and somebody had written a story about questioning a fact in the story, in our story, but in other stories too. And I just watched it just rise in popularity. And it wasn't until we did a separate debunk of that claim that it dropped again. And so, I mean, it just really brought home to me that while it's awesome and amazing when we produce great journalism around a big breaking news event, simply having the accurate information out there may not be enough. You may need to do something separate to really debunk a false claim. So that is pretty much how we handle it. And I will say that we work really closely with the reporters who are doing that work on the main story to be absolutely sure that whatever we're debunking is accurate.
Great, thank you. I have a question about, you mentioned clean claims. Can you give us a real world example, hopefully tied to voting? Because this is an elections network. Can you give us an example, a real world example of what a clean claim might look like? And how would you treat that differently than a dirty claim per se?
Clean claim. A clean claim to me is a claim, one that can be fact checked. I mean, simply. And by that, I mean one that is free of opinion or bias or doesn't have vague elements in it. You know, it's saying something that's pretty specific. I actually can't think of one related to voting right now, but for example, if someone said, no one in America has ever voted by mail. I mean, it's a ridiculous example, but you know, if someone had said something like that, it's a definitive statement, right? I mean, there's history, there were 5 states that were doing it or however many states before. That's something that we can go after. If someone says, I heard from a friend that, you weren't able to, that there was a report showing that, discarded ballots were in this river. That's difficult. I mean, that's not a clean claim to me. Who's your friend? What's the source? What report? You could spend the whole rest of your life searching for that. It may not exist. That is a very difficult claim to tackle with a straight debunk. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't handle it in some way in another story format, but to me, it would raise a lot of flags. It would be very difficult and sticky to get at.
Great, thank you for that additional explanation. And again, we have about 5 minutes if anyone else wants to ask any questions via chat. I did have another question. You mentioned Vision 2020. How much of your work has shifted from being reactionary to sort of that local reporters can be doing to be more proactive about misinformation in their reporting? How has that situation evolved over the past few years?
I can start on that. I think, over the past few years, we've realized more and more that people are not as trusting in news organizations and and sometimes just have questions and they just want to know the facts. They're on they're on their phones, they're looking at news in a different way. And we can help them understand complex situations with quick explainers that are easy to digest. People are receptive to information that way rather than, they may be to a 1,500, 1,700, 1,800 word story. And so even when you look at things like our political coverage, just take the last debate, for instance, we have a feature now, we have a main bar, and we may have what is called a latest, which are short bits of information, but we also gave readers 5 takeaways from the debate. People are liking digestible information and they want things easily explained. And I think that is influencing the way that we have kind of changed our report from being, bigger, longer pieces to more digestible kinds of information and just more explanatory things, because that we know sometimes speaks across the partisan lines in a way that something like a fact check would not.
That's great. Thank you. One final question. And I think this is just nitty gritty, helpful stuff for local reporters out there. From your vantage points, what should local reporters be focusing on over the next 3 weeks? What can local reporters do to make your job a little bit easier as those fact checks or misinformation trickles up from a variety of places?
This is what reporters can do to help themselves in their newsrooms cover this.
Yeah. Or what should we be looking out for in the next 3 weeks? Anything misinformation or any sort of claims out there that are particularly difficult or that you see being repeated over and over? Is there anything practical stuff that we can do in the next 3 weeks?
I would say, okay, so 3 things spring to mind. One is, again, explanatory journalism. Be proactive. Know exactly what the laws are in your state, know about the voting process, know when the polls close, understand all of that information, have it there, print it out, put it on your desk, know it. I would say also, keep an open mind and look across the board. And, I think we're going to see a lot of misinformation around the voting process. I think we already are. And so, I think definitely look for that and look for a little bit of, misinformation around, again, the health of the candidates. We produced a story around the claims that we saw swirling after President Trump announced that he was ill with coronavirus. They were far-reaching, and there were many. So, I think keep an eye on that as well. And know the issues. Like if there are local issues in your states, understand them and create lists, really look for the information, like what are people saying about these issues and understand that. I would also really say that if it's possible, to see if you can brush up a little bit on verification work, your verification skills, to understand, how to just do a Google reverse image search, like this is, or looking at, there are a number of online tools now that can help with verification work. And I think that it could be really worth it when you're in the moment trying to understand if something is real or not. Certainly that is one area of misinformation that we see rising is visual misinformation. So I would say focus your attention on that too.
My final word as an old editor is prep.
Yeah.
On your local issues, on what matters in your community and what people are talking about, and get ahead of what could be happening with the election, whatever kind of election you're having in your area.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Amanda, Karen. Another thank you to Craig Newmark for supporting this work. Thank you so much to the AP for working with us on this crucial series of events. This has been super informative and super helpful. Check out API's Twitter for some live tweeting from this event. Our YouTube page has previous recordings from the past few weeks. We're going to send out a recap, a recording of the video. Might even include a recording from our conversation with Jane Litvinenko, where we get into that verification process that Karen was emphasizing as being really important. But yeah, in the meantime, don't hesitate to connect with us via the Trusted Elections Network. Thank you again, folks, for being here. Yeah, good luck this election season. But if you need any support, we'll be here for you. Thanks.
Thank you.